Sarah Martinez adjusted her carry-on bag as she walked through the bustling terminal at San International Airport. The evening flight to New York was already boarding, and she clutched her first-class ticket with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. After 8 grueling years as a Navy SEAL, she was finally heading home to start a new chapter of her life. The small tattoo on her wrist caught the fluorescent light as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. It was a simple trident symbol, barely 2 inches long, but it represented everything she had sacrificed and achieved. Most people never noticed it, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Her service record was classified, her missions were secrets she would take to her grave, and her identity as one of the first female Navy SEALs was something she kept private. Sarah had saved for months to afford the first-class seat. After years of sleeping in cramped bunks and eating military rations, she wanted to treat herself to some luxury on this important journey. She was heading to New York for a job interview with a private security firm, a chance to use her skills in the civilian world while keeping a lower profile. As she made her way down the jet bridge, Sarah's trained eyes automatically scanned her surroundings. Even in civilian clothes, she moved with the precise, alert posture that years of military training had ingrained in her. She wore simple jeans and a black sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance screamed military, but those who knew what to look for might notice the way she carried herself, the way her eyes never stopped moving, always assessing potential threats. The first-class cabin was nearly empty when she boarded. Sarah found her seat, 2A, a window seat that would give her a clear view of the wing and engines. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, already looking forward to the extra legroom and better service. For someone who had spent years cramped in military transports, this felt like the height of luxury. She was reviewing some documents for her upcoming interview when other passengers began filing past. Sarah barely looked up, focused on memorizing the details of the security firm she hoped to join. The company specialized in protecting high-profile executives and had specifically reached out to her because of her unique background, though they had been vague about how they had learned of her service record. About 10 minutes before takeoff, a commotion near the front of the plane caught her attention. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit was speaking loudly to one of the flight attendants, his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of entitlement and irritation. "This is absolutely unacceptable," the man was saying, his face red with anger. "I fly first class every week, and I specifically requested seat 2A. That woman has taken my seat." Sarah looked up to see the man pointing directly at her. He appeared to be in his 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of confidence that came from wealth and privilege. His suit probably cost more than Sarah had made in a month during her military service, and the gold watch on his wrist caught the cabin lights as he gestured emphatically. The flight attendant, a young woman named Jessica according to her name tag, looked uncomfortable as she approached Sarah's seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely, "but there seems to be some confusion about seat assignments. Mr. Harrison says this is his seat." Sarah pulled out her boarding pass and showed it to Jessica. The seat number was clearly printed. 2A, this is definitely my assigned seat, she said calmly. "I bought this ticket 3 weeks ago and selected this specific seat." Mr. Harrison pushed past the flight attendant and loomed over Sarah's seat. Up close, she could smell expensive cologne mixed with the sharp scent of alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot, and she suspected he had been drinking in the airport lounge before boarding. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know what kind of mistake the airline made, but this seat belongs to someone who actually deserves to be in first class. Why don't you take your little coach ticket and find your real seat back where you belong?" The cabin fell silent. Other first-class passengers turned to watch the confrontation, some looking uncomfortable, others seeming entertained by the drama. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but years of military discipline kept her voice level and controlled. "Sir, I paid for this seat just like everyone else," she replied firmly. "My boarding pass clearly shows 2A, and I'm not moving." Mr. Harrison's face grew even redder. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Harrison Blake, CEO of Blake Industries. I've flown over 2 million miles with this airline, and I demand the service I deserve. You clearly don't belong in first class, and I'm not going to be inconvenienced by some mix-up involving." He paused, his eyes scanning Sarah dismissively. "Someone like you." The implication in his tone was clear, and Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She had faced discrimination before, both as a woman in the military and as someone from a working-class background trying to make her way in elite circles. But she had learned to channel that anger into focus and determination rather than explosive confrontation. Jessica returned with what appeared to be a supervisor, an older man with silver hair and a nameplate reading, Thomas, Senior Flight Attendant. He looked between Harrison and Sarah with practiced diplomatic calm, clearly experienced in handling difficult passengers. "Let me see both boarding passes and check our system," Thomas said professionally. He examined Sarah's ticket carefully, then looked at Harrison's phone, where he had pulled up his mobile boarding pass. "Sir," Thomas said to Harrison, "your seat assignment shows 3A, not 2A. This passenger is correctly seated." Harrison's eyes flashed with fury. "That's impossible. I specifically requested 2A when I booked this flight. I always sit in 2A. There must be an error in your system." Thomas checked his tablet again, scrolling through what appeared to be the passenger manifest. "Mr. Harrison, I show that you originally had seat 2A, but it was changed to 3A 3 weeks ago when this passenger purchased her ticket and specifically requested. The system automatically moved you to maintain your first-class accommodation." "I don't care what your computer says," Harrison snapped. "I've been flying first class since before this girl was born. I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of inconvenience because some random person decided they wanted to play dress-up in first class." Sarah stood up slowly, her military training evident in the controlled precision of her movement. At 5'6", she wasn't imposing in terms of size, but there was something in her posture and the steady way she met Harrison's glare that made him take a small step backward. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of leading men and women in life-or-death situations. "I purchased this seat legitimately. I'm not causing any problems, and I'm not moving. If you have an issue with the airline's seating policies, I suggest you take it up with management after the flight." Harrison looked around the cabin, perhaps expecting support from other passengers, but found only uncomfortable stares and averted gazes. The few people who met his eyes seemed more sympathetic to Sarah than to his increasingly aggressive demands. "This is ridiculous," he declared loudly. "I refuse to be treated this way by some nobody who probably bought her ticket with food stamps. Security, I want security up here now." The comment about food stamps hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it hurt her personally, but because it revealed the depth of Harrison's prejudice and assumptions. He had decided, based purely on her appearance and his own biases, that she didn't belong in first class and was willing to humiliate her publicly to get what he wanted. Thomas stepped between them, his professional demeanor becoming more firm. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to lower your voice and return to your assigned seat. We're holding up departure, and your behavior is disturbing other passengers." "My behavior?" Harrison laughed bitterly. "I'm not the problem here. The problem is your airline's complete lack of customer service. I spend over $100,000 a year on flights, and this is how you treat me, by forcing me to deal with some charity case who clearly doesn't understand first-class etiquette." By now, passengers in the economy section were craning their necks to see what was happening. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking the flight crew to prepare for departure, but Thomas held up his hand and spoke into his radio headset, clearly asking for a delay. Sarah remained standing, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her body ready for action if Harrison became physically aggressive. She had dealt with hostile individuals in far more dangerous situations than this, but something about the public nature of the humiliation and the man's casual cruelty was testing her patience in a way that combat never had. "Sir," Thomas said to Harrison, "I'm going to ask you one more time to take your assigned seat. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight." Harrison's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Remove me? Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you'll be in if you throw off a Platinum Elite member for asking to sit in the seat I deserve? My lawyers will own this airline by the time we're done." He turned back to Sarah, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone but which carried clear menace. "Look, whatever your name is, I'm trying to be nice here. I'll give you $500 cash to move to coach where you belong. That's probably more money than you make in a month, so take the deal and stop causing problems for people who actually matter." The offer of money was the final straw. Sarah had endured his assumptions about her background, his dismissive attitude, and his public attempts to humiliate her. But the suggestion that she could be bought off, that she was so desperate for money that she would accept payment to give up something that was rightfully hers, crossed a line that even her military discipline couldn't ignore. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of steel that made enemy combatants think twice about their life choices. "I wouldn't take your money if I was starving. I earned my seat on this plane just like I've earned everything else in my life. The only person who doesn't belong here is someone who thinks they can bully and buy their way through life without consequence." The cabin was now completely silent, except for the distant sound of ground crew working outside. Even the flight attendants had stopped their pre-flight preparations to watch the confrontation. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of stares, some supportive, others merely curious about how the drama would unfold. Harrison's face was now purple with rage. "That's it," he declared, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the airline's customer service line right now. I'm going to make sure you're banned from flying with them ever again. And then I'm calling my lawyers. You have no idea who you're messing with, lady." As he spoke, he began scrolling through his phone with exaggerated movements, clearly intending to make good on his threats. Sarah watched him calmly, noting the slight tremor in his hands that suggested his anger was mixing with alcohol to create an increasingly volatile situation. Thomas spoke into his headset again, and within moments, 2 airport security officers appeared at the front of the plane. They were both large men in uniform, and their presence seemed to give Harrison renewed confidence. "Officers," Harrison called out before anyone else could speak, "I need this woman removed from my seat immediately. She's refusing to follow airline policy and is being verbally abusive to me and the crew." Sarah almost laughed at the blatant reversal of the situation, but her training kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, the truth often mattered less than perception and politics. Harrison clearly had experience using his wealth and status to manipulate situations in his favor. The security officers looked between the 2 passengers, taking in Harrison's expensive clothes and confident demeanor versus Sarah's simple outfit and calm but determined stance. One of them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, turned to Thomas. "What's the situation here?" he asked. Thomas quickly explained the seating dispute, showing both boarding passes to the officers and confirming that Sarah was in her correctly assigned seat. He also mentioned Harrison's increasingly aggressive behavior and his refusal to take his assigned seat in 3A. Harrison interrupted repeatedly, his voice growing louder with each interjection. "This is a waste of everyone's time. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never had to deal with this kind of nonsense. That woman clearly doesn't belong in first class, and anyone with eyes can see she's not the kind of passenger who usually flies up here." One of the security officers, a younger man with a serious expression, looked directly at Sarah. "Ma'am, are you willing to accept an upgrade to business class to resolve this situation? The gentleman seems very upset, and it might be easier for everyone if we could find a compromise." The suggestion that she should be the one to compromise, despite being completely in the right, sent a wave of frustration through Sarah. This was exactly the kind of situation she had faced throughout her military career, being asked to step aside or accommodate others even when she had done nothing wrong, simply because it was easier than dealing with a difficult man's tantrum. "Officer," she replied with the kind of respectful but firm tone she had used when addressing superior officers who were making unreasonable requests, "I appreciate your attempt to find a solution, but I'm not the one causing problems here. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I haven't raised my voice or made any threats, and I haven't broken any rules. I don't see why I should be inconvenienced because someone else is behaving badly." Harrison stepped forward, his face now close enough to Sarah's that she could smell the alcohol on his breath more strongly. "Listen to me very carefully," he said in a low voice that was clearly intended to be threatening. "You have no idea what you're getting into. I have friends in very high places, and I can make your life very difficult. Take the business class seat and walk away, or you're going to regret this for a very long time." The threat was clear and unambiguous, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her when faced with a genuine threat. Her military training kicked in automatically, assessing Harrison as a potential combatant and finding him severely wanting. He was soft, out of shape, intoxicated, and operating purely on bluster and assumed privilege. But this wasn't a combat zone, and Harrison wasn't an enemy soldier. This was a civilian aircraft full of innocent people, and she was no longer a Navy SEAL on a mission. She was just Sarah Martinez, trying to start a new life and hopping to get to New York without incident. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "are you threatening me?" The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment his aggressive posture faltered. The security officers had heard his words clearly, and their demeanor shifted noticeably as they realized the situation was escalating beyond a simple seating dispute. "I'm not threatening anyone," Harrison said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm simply explaining the reality of the situation. People like me have influence and people like you don't. That's just how the world works." The older security officer stepped forward, his voice carrying clear authority. "Sir, I need you to step back and calm down. Making threats toward another passenger is a serious matter, and I won't tolerate it on my watch." Harrison looked around the cabin again, perhaps realizing for the first time that his behavior was being witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom were recording the confrontation with their phones. In an age of social media and viral videos, his public meltdown was likely to have consequences far beyond this single flight. Thomas returned from a brief conversation with someone on his radio headset. "Mr. Harrison," he announced, "I've spoken with our operations manager, and we're prepared to offer you a full refund for your ticket if you'd prefer to take a later flight. However, if you choose to remain on this aircraft, you'll need to take your assigned seat in 3A and allow us to proceed with departure." "A refund?" Harrison sputtered. "I don't want a refund. I want the seat that I deserve, and I want this woman removed from my plane." "It's not your plane, sir," the younger security officer said firmly. "And the passenger in 2A has done nothing wrong. You have two choices: take your assigned seat and behave appropriately, or leave the aircraft voluntarily." Sarah watched Harrison's face cycle through anger, disbelief, and what appeared to be the dawning realization that his usual tactics weren't working. For probably the first time in years, he was in a situation where his wealth and status couldn't immediately solve his problem. The standoff continued for another few minutes, with Harrison alternating between demands, threats, and attempts to negotiate some kind of face-saving compromise. But Thomas and the security officers remained firm, and gradually it became clear that he would have to make a choice. Finally, with poor grace and continued muttering about lawsuits and complaints, Harrison stalked back to seat 3A, just one row behind Sarah. As he settled into his seat, still radiating anger and resentment, Sarah could feel his glare boring into the back of her head. The security officers left the plane, the flight attendants resumed their preparations, and within 15 minutes they were backing away from the gate. Sarah stared out her window as sand fell away below them, wondering if she had made the right choice in standing her ground. Part of her wondered if it might have been easier to just take the business class seat and avoid the confrontation entirely. But another part of her, the part that had endured years of training and combat to earn her place among the most elite warriors in the world, knew that some battles were worth fighting even when the stakes seemed small. She had spent too many years proving that she belonged in places where others said she didn't fit to give up her seat to someone who thought he could bully her into submission. As the plane climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah tried to focus on her interview preparation, but she could feel Harrison's continued hostility radiating from the seat behind her. She had a feeling this flight was going to be longer than she had anticipated, and she began to wonder what other unpleasant surprises awaited her on the journey to her new life. The first hour of the flight passed in tense silence. Sarah tried to concentrate on her interview materials, but the hostile energy emanating from Harrison's seat made it difficult to focus. She could hear him making phone calls, his voice deliberately loud enough for her to overhear his complaints to what sounded like various airline executives and legal contacts. "Yes, I'm telling you this is completely unacceptable," Harrison was saying into his phone for the third time. "I was publicly humiliated by some random woman who clearly doesn't belong in first class, and your crew did nothing to protect a loyal customer. I want her blacklisted from your airline permanently." Sarah kept her eyes on her documents, but her military training made it impossible to ignore potential threats, even verbal ones. She noted the increasing slur in Harrison's words as he continued drinking the complimentary alcohol that came with first-class service. The flight attendants had already brought him 3 small bottles of whiskey, and his voice was becoming more aggressive with each drink. Jessica approached Sarah's seat with an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry about the earlier incident. Is there anything I can get you to make your flight more comfortable?" "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied quietly, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. Just some water when you have a chance. As Jessica walked away, Harrison's voice rose again. Did you see how she talked to me? He was saying to whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of his call. Complete disrespect for a premium passenger. These people need to learn their place. An elderly woman in seat 1B turned around and gave Harrison a disapproving look. Young man, she said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, your phone conversation is disturbing everyone in first class. Perhaps you could conduct your business more quietly. Harrison glared at her but seemed momentarily taken aback by her directness. The woman was clearly wealthy, dressed in elegant clothes with jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. She wasn't someone he could easily dismiss as being beneath him. I'm conducting important business, he said defensively. Maybe if the airline hadn't put me in this situation, I wouldn't need to make these calls. The situation you created by behaving badly, the woman replied coolly. I watched the entire incident, and that young woman did nothing wrong. Your behavior, however, was absolutely disgraceful. Other first-class passengers were now openly starring, and Harrison seemed to realize that he was losing the court of public opinion. He ended his phone call abruptly and waved Jessica over to his seat. I need another drink, he demanded, and I want to speak to the captain about the service on this flight. Jessica exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, who was observing from the galley area. Sir, I think you've had quite a bit to drink already, perhaps some coffee instead. Don't tell me what I can and can't drink, Harrison snapped. I paid for first-class service and that includes alcohol. Bring me another whiskey now. Thomas stepped forward with the diplomatic but firm manner Sarah recognized from her own experience dealing with difficult personnel. Mr. Harrison, federal regulations require us to refuse alcohol service to passengers who appear intoxicated. I'm going to ask Jessica to bring you some coffee and something to eat. Harrison's face turned red again. Intoxicated? I'm not intoxicated. I'm angry about the poor service on this flight, and I have every right to express my dissatisfaction. If you don't bring me what I ordered, I'll make sure everyone knows how terribly this airline treats its best customers. Sarah couldn't help but admire the flight crew's professionalism in dealing with Harrison's increasingly erratic behavior. She had seen similar situations in the military, where alcohol and wounded pride combined to create volatile individuals who needed careful handling. About 2 hours into the flight, during the meal service, Harrison made his next move. He got up from his seat and approached Sarah directly, swaying slightly as he walked. The cabin lights had been dimmed, and most passengers were either eating or trying to sleep, but his movement caught everyone's attention. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, he said, leaning over Sarah's seat in a way that was clearly intended to be intimidating. I realize I may have come across as harsh, but I was just trying to help you understand how things work in first class. People up here have certain expectations, certain standards. Sarah looked up from her meal, her expression neutral but alert. She could smell the alcohol on his breath more strongly now, and his eyes had the unfocused look of someone who had been drinking steadily for hours. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite comfortable with first-class standards, she replied evenly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my dinner in peace. But Harrison didn't move. Instead, he sat down in the empty seat next to her, despite the fact that it clearly belonged to another passenger who was currently in the restroom. See, that's where you're wrong, he continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. You think you understand, but you don't really fit in here. It's not your fault. You probably grew up differently than people like me. But there are unwritten rules, ways of behaving that you need to learn if you want to sit up here with the adults. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. Mr. Harrison, you're drunk, you're in someone else's seat, and you're bothering me while I'm trying to eat. Please go back to your own seat. Drunk? Harrison laughed loudly, causing other passengers to look over with concern. I'm not drunk. I'm trying to educate you about proper behavior. Maybe if you showed a little gratitude for the lesson instead of being so defensive, you might actually learn something. Thomas appeared beside them almost immediately. Mr. Harrison, you need to return to your seat right now. You can't sit in a seat that's not assigned to you, and you're disturbing other passengers. Harrison ignored him, his focus entirely on Sarah. You know what your problem is? You think because you bought a ticket, that makes you equal to everyone else up here. But money doesn't buy class, money doesn't buy breeding, and it certainly doesn't buy respect that has to be earned over time. The passenger whose seat Harrison had taken returned from the restroom and stood in the aisle, looking confused and uncomfortable about the situation. He was a well-dressed businessman who clearly didn't want to get involved in a confrontation, but also wanted his seat back. "Sir," Thomas said more firmly, "if you don't return to your seat immediately, I'll have no choice but to contact the captain and have law enforcement meet us when we land." Harrison finally looked up at Thomas, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "Law enforcement? For trying to have a conversation? This is exactly what I'm talking about, complete overreaction to a simple social interaction." He turned back to Sarah with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "See how sensitive everyone is? They can't handle a little honest feedback about improving yourself." Sarah had endured enough. She stood up slowly, her movement causing Harrison to lean back instinctively. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded immediate attention from hardened military personnel. "Mr. Harrison, I'm going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. I don't need your advice, your approval, or your permission to exist in this space. I earned my seat through my own work, just like I've earned everything else in my life. Your opinion of whether I fit in is completely irrelevant to me." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You've spent this entire flight trying to intimidate, bully, and demean me because you think your money gives you the right to treat other people badly. But here's what you don't understand. I've faced real threats from people far more dangerous than you, and I'm not impressed by your tantrum." The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even passengers in the rows behind them had stopped their conversations to listen to the confrontation. Harrison's face was cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and what might have been the beginning of fear. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. "I can destroy you financially. I can make sure you never work in this country again." Sarah smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Harrison shrink back in his chair. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that predators recognized when they suddenly realized they had misjudged their prey. "Mr. Harrison, you keep making threats about destroying me, but you don't even know my name. You've made assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of based on nothing but your own prejudices. That's not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that only Harrison could hear clearly. "I've spent 8 years in situations where the wrong decision meant people died. I've been trained to handle threats, assess dangers, and neutralize problems efficiently. You're not a threat. You're just a drunk, angry man throwing a tantrum because the world didn't arrange itself to suit your convenience." Harrison's eyes widened, and for the first time since the flight began, he seemed to grasp that he might be out of his depth. Something in Sarah's tone and posture was finally getting through his alcohol-fueled arrogance. Thomas and Jessica had been watching the exchange with growing concern, and Thomas now stepped directly between them. "Both of you need to calm down and return to your seats immediately. Mr. Harrison, you've been warned multiple times about your behavior. This is your final warning before we contact the authorities." But Harrison was no longer looking at Thomas. His gaze was fixed on Sarah's left wrist, where her sleeve had pulled back slightly to reveal the edge of her trident tattoo. His face went pale as he stared at the small symbol, his alcohol-clouded mind apparently struggling to process what he was seeing. "Is that," he started to say, then stopped, his voice suddenly uncertain. Sarah followed his gaze to her wrist and realized what had caught his attention. She pulled her sleeve down to cover the tattoo, but it was too late. Harrison had seen enough to recognize what it meant, even in his intoxicated state. "You're military," he said, and for the first time all evening, his voice was quiet and uncertain rather than aggressive. "Former military," Sarah corrected, sitting back down and hoping the revelation would end the confrontation. "Now, please go back to your seat so we can all finish this flight in peace." But Harrison didn't move. Instead, he stared at her with a mixture of confusion and what might have been the beginning of respect. His alcohol-addled brain was clearly trying to reconcile his assumptions about her with this new information. "What branch?" he asked, his aggressive demeanor replaced by something approaching curiosity. Sarah sighed, realizing that her attempt to de-escalate by revealing her military background might have backfired. "Navy," she said simply, hoping that would be enough to satisfy his questions. Harrison nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "That explains a lot," he said quietly. "The way you carry yourself, the way you handled the way you didn't back down." He was quiet for a moment, and Sarah began to hope that perhaps her military service would finally earn her the respect he had been unwilling to grant her as a civilian. She had seen this before people who treated her dismissively until they learned about her military background, then suddenly viewed her with entirely different eyes. "Navy," Harrison repeated, seeming to consider the implications. "What did you do? Administrative work, communications." The questions revealed that even now, even knowing she was a veteran, he couldn't imagine her in a combat role. His assumptions about women in the military were apparently as limited as his assumptions about who belonged in first class. "I was a SEAL," Sarah said quietly, hoping to end the conversation once and for all. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. He stared at her with his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. Around them, other passengers who had overheard the conversation were also staring, their expressions ranging from amazement to skepticism. "That's impossible," Harrison said finally. "Women can't be SEALs." Sarah's jaw tightened. Even after everything that had happened, even after she had proven herself in countless missions and earned the respect of her fellow warriors, she still encountered this reaction. The assumption that her gender automatically disqualified her from elite military service was one she had been fighting her entire career. "Women have been allowed in SEAL training since 2016, she said patiently, though her voice carried an edge of frustration. "Several of us have completed the program successfully." Harrison shook his head, his alcohol-impaired reasoning struggling to process this information. "But you don't look like." "Like what?" Sarah asked, her tone becoming dangerous again. "Like a warrior, like someone who could handle the physical and mental demands of special operations, like someone who could successfully complete missions that most men can't even imagine." The cabin was now completely silent, except for the sound of the engines. Every passenger within earshot was hanging on every word of the conversation, and several were discreetly recording with their phones. Harrison seemed to realize he was digging himself into an even deeper hole. I mean no offense, but SEALs are supposed to be." "Supposed to be what, Mr. Harrison?" Sarah interrupted. "Male, larger, more intimidating. Let me ask you something. What exactly do you think makes someone qualified to be a SEAL?" Harrison opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing he had no idea how to answer that question without revealing more of his prejudices. Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a briefing to troops. "SEAL training isn't about being the biggest or the loudest. It's about mental toughness, the ability to work as part of a team, physical endurance, tactical intelligence, and the willingness to put the mission before your own comfort or safety. It's about proving that you can be counted on when everything goes wrong and people's lives are on the line." She paused, her eyes meeting Harrison's directly. "Tell me, Mr. Harrison, based on your behavior tonight, how do you think you would measure up against those standards?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison's face cycled through various expressions as he apparently tried to think of some way to respond that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. Thomas chose that moment to intervene again. "Mr. Harrison, regardless of anyone's military background, you need to return to your seat immediately. You've disrupted this flight long enough." But Harrison was now fixated on Sarah, his earlier hostility replaced by a kind of morbid fascination. "What kind of missions did you do?" he asked, ignoring Thomas completely. "That's classified," Sarah replied firmly, "and none of your business." "But did you see combat?" The question revealed just how little he understood about military service, particularly special operations. Sarah had seen more combat than most career soldiers, but she wasn't about to share those experiences with someone who had spent the evening trying to humiliate her. "Mr. Harrison, my military service is not entertainment for your curiosity," she said coldly. "I'm not going to sit here and prove my worthiness to you by recounting classified missions or personal trauma for your amusement." Harrison seemed taken aback by her response. Perhaps he had expected her to be flattered by his interest or eager to share war stories that would impress him. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful," he said, though his words were still slurred from alcohol. This changes everything. If I had known you were military. If you had known I was military, what? Sarah asked. You would have treated me with respect. You would have acknowledged my right to sit in a seat I paid for. That says more about your character than mine, Mr. Harrison. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming quieter but more intense. Here's what you need to understand: my worth as a human being, my right to be treated with dignity, and my place on this aircraft have nothing to do with my military service. I earned respect through my actions, not through a uniform or a title. The elderly woman from seat 1B had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest. Now she turned around to face both Sarah and Harrison directly. Young lady, she said to Sarah, thank you for your service. And Mr. Harrison, you should be ashamed of yourself. This woman served our country with honor, and you spent the evening treating her like she didn't deserve basic human decency. Her words seemed to carry particular weight with Harrison, who looked genuinely stricken for the first time all evening. Perhaps it was the combination of alcohol, exhaustion, and the growing realization of how badly he had behaved, but his aggressive posture finally began to crumble. Harrison sat in stunned silence for several minutes, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. The alcohol that had fueled his earlier aggression now seemed to be making him emotional and unpredictable in a different way. His eyes were glassy, and his hands shook slightly as he processed what he had learned. I should, he started several times, unable to complete a sentence. Finally, he managed to say, I owe you an apology. Sarah studied his face carefully. Years of reading people in high-stress situations had taught her to distinguish between genuine remorse and tactical manipulation. Harrison's expression suggested real shock and the beginning of actual regret, but she wasn't ready to accept his apology just yet. Mr. Harrison, she said quietly, you don't owe me an apology because I'm a veteran. You owe me an apology because you treated another human being terribly based on your own prejudices and assumptions. Harrison nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure he fully understood the distinction she was making. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was horrible to you. I don't know what came over me. Thomas had been standing nearby, ready to intervene if the situation escalated again, but now he seemed cautiously optimistic that the confrontation might finally be winding down. Several other passengers were still watching, though some had returned to their own activities now that the immediate drama seemed to be passing. I think, Thomas said diplomatically, it would be best if Mr. Harrison returned to his seat now so everyone can finish their flight peacefully. Harrison stood up unsteadily, swaying slightly as the alcohol continued to affect his balance. But instead of going back to his seat, he remained standing next to Sarah's row, looking down at her with an expression that might have been trying to convey respect, but mostly just looked confused. Can I ask you something? He said. What made you decide to become a SEAL? Sarah sighed, recognizing that he wasn't going to let this go easily. Part of her understood his curiosity. Most civilians had never met a Navy SEAL, let alone a female one. But another part of her resented being treated like a museum exhibit, especially by someone who had spent hours trying to humiliate her. Mr. Harrison, my reasons for joining the military are personal, and I'm not comfortable discussing them with you, she replied firmly. What I will say is that I served my country with honor, completed my mission successfully, and earned the respect of my teammates and commanders. But Harrison seemed driven by some need to understand, perhaps to make sense of how badly he had misjudged the situation. But the training, everyone knows how brutal SEAL training is. How did you get through it? The question revealed his continuing assumption that her success must somehow be explainable by special circumstances or lowered standards. Sarah had heard variations of this question countless times, usually from people who couldn't accept that a woman might simply be tough enough, smart enough, and determined enough to succeed where many men failed. I got through it the same way everyone gets through it, she said, her patience wearing thin again. By refusing to quit, by pushing past what I thought were my limits, and by proving every single day that I belonged there. But surely they must have made accommodations. No, the word came out sharper than Sarah had intended, cutting through Harrison's speculation like a knife. There were no accommodations. The standards were the same for everyone. I carried the same pack weight, ran the same distances, completed the same exercises, and passed the same tests as every man in my class. Harrison seemed genuinely surprised by this information. But I read somewhere that they were considering changing the requirements to allow more women to qualify. What you read was probably speculation by people who, like you, couldn't imagine women succeeding without special help, Sarah replied coolly. The Navy conducted extensive studies before opening SEAL training to women. They determined that the existing standards were appropriate and necessary, regardless of gender. She paused, studying Harrison's face to see if he was beginning to understand. Mr. Harrison, your assumption that I needed special treatment to succeed says more about your prejudices than about my capabilities or the military's standards. The elderly woman from 1B had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest. Now she spoke up again, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Mr. Harrison, she said, I've been listening to your questions, and I think you're missing the point entirely. This young woman doesn't owe you explanations or justifications for her accomplishments. The fact that you're demanding proof that she really earned her achievements shows that you still don't respect her as an equal. Harrison turned to look at the older woman, his face flushing with embarrassment. I was just trying to understand. What you were trying to understand, the woman continued firmly, is how someone you assumed was beneath you could actually be far more accomplished than you are. Instead of examining your own prejudices, you're interrogating her as if she needs to prove herself to you. The accuracy of this observation seemed to hit Harrison like a physical blow. He stood there swaying slightly, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response that wouldn't make him look even worse. Sarah found herself feeling an unexpected moment of sympathy for him. She had seen this reaction before when people's worldview was suddenly challenged by information that didn't fit their preconceptions. The cognitive dissonance could be genuinely disturbing, especially for someone who had probably never had their assumptions questioned so directly. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice softer than it had been all evening, I think you should go back to your seat and maybe think about what happened here tonight. Not because I'm a veteran, but because you treated someone badly based on assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong. Harrison nodded slowly, finally seeming to accept that the conversation was over. As he made his way back to seat 3A, he moved carefully, whether from the alcohol or from the weight of his new understanding, Sarah couldn't tell. The rest of the flight passed much more quietly. Harrison remained in his seat, occasionally glancing forward toward Sarah but making no more attempts at conversation. He had stopped drinking and appeared to be sobering up gradually, his expression becoming more thoughtful and less aggressive as the hours passed. About an hour before landing, Jessica approached Sarah's seat with a warm smile. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for handling that situation with such grace, she said quietly. I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen someone maintain their dignity under that kind of pressure. Thank you, Sarah replied. I hope Mr. Harrison is feeling better. Jessica glanced back toward Harrison's seat. He asked me to tell you that he's deeply sorry for his behavior. He said he'd like to speak with you before we land, but only if you're willing. Sarah considered this request. Part of her just wanted to finish the flight without any more drama, but another part was curious about what Harrison might want to say now that he had time to think about his actions. Tell him he can speak with me when we're getting off the plane, she said finally. But make it clear that I'm not obligated to accept whatever he wants to say. As the plane began its descent into New York, Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared for what she hoped would be a positive end to a difficult journey. The job interview that awaited her the next morning suddenly seemed much easier by comparison to what she had already endured. When the plane touched down at JFK, Sarah remained in her seat while other passengers filed out. Harrison had also stayed behind, waiting in the aisle near her row with an expression that looked genuinely humble for the first time all evening. He started, then stopped. I realize I don't even know your name. I spent all evening making assumptions about you, but I never bothered to learn who you actually are. Sarah Martinez, she said simply. Ms. Martinez, Harrison continued, his voice much steadier now that he had sobered up. I owe you a sincere apology, not just for the seating dispute, but for everything that followed. My behavior was inexcusable, and I'm genuinely ashamed of how I treated you. Sarah studied his face carefully. The arrogance and hostility were gone, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. His eyes were clearer now, and his posture suggested humility rather than the aggressive entitlement he had displayed earlier. I accept your apology, Mr. Harrison, she said. I hope you learned something from this experience. Harrison nodded earnestly. I did, more than I'm comfortable admitting. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Can I ask, what you said about facing real threats from people more dangerous than me, were you referring to combat situations? Sarah hesitated. She generally preferred to keep her military experiences private, especially the classified operations that had shaped much of her career. But something in Harrison's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than the morbid fascination he had displayed earlier. Yes, she said simply. I served in several combat zones during my 8 years with the teams. Harrison was quiet for a moment, processing this information. I can't imagine what that must have been like, the things you must have seen, the decisions you had to make. It was challenging, Sarah acknowledged. But it was also the most meaningful work I've ever done. Knowing that your actions might save lives, protect innocent people, or serve something larger than yourself, there's no feeling quite like that. And now you're transitioning to civilian life. I have a job interview tomorrow with a private security firm. It's time to start a new chapter. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Ms. Martinez, I know this might sound strange given how badly I behaved tonight, but I want you to know that if you ever need anything, a reference, a connection, any kind of help at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. He pulled out his business card and handed it to her. I mean that sincerely. What I did tonight was wrong, but it taught me something important about myself that I needed to learn. Sarah took the card and studied it briefly. Harrison Blake, CEO, Blake Industries. She recognized the company name. They were involved in defense contracting and had offices around the world. Mr. Harrison, she said carefully, while I appreciate the gesture, I hope you understand that I can't just forget what happened tonight because you feel bad about it now. Personal growth is admirable, but it doesn't erase the impact of your actions. You're absolutely right, Harrison agreed quickly. I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness or pretend that an apology fixes everything. I just wanted you to know that tonight changed my perspective on some things I thought I understood, and I'm grateful for that lesson even though I didn't deserve to learn it from someone I treated so poorly. As they finally left the plane together, walking through the jet bridge toward the terminal, Harrison made one final comment. Ms. Martinez, can I ask what company you're interviewing with tomorrow? Apex Security Solutions, Sarah replied. They specialize in executive protection and corporate security. Harrison stopped walking so abruptly that other passengers had to move around them. His expression had changed completely, and he was staring at Sarah with a look of amazement. Did you say Apex Security Solutions? He asked. Yes, do you know them? Harrison began to laugh, though there was no humor in the sound. Ms. Martinez, Apex Security Solutions is a subsidiary of Blake Industries. The company you're interviewing with tomorrow, I own it. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications of this revelation hit her. The job interview she had been preparing for, the new career opportunity she was counting on, the chance to start fresh in civilian life. All of it was now connected to the man who had spent the evening trying to humiliate her. I see, she said quietly, her mind racing through the possible consequences. Would Harrison use his position to retaliate against her for embarrassing him? Would he make sure she didn't get the job? Or worse, would he try to use his power to manipulate the situation in some way that benefited him? Harrison seemed to understand what she was thinking. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that what happened tonight will have absolutely no bearing on your interview process. Apex operates independently, and their hearing decisions are made based solely on qualifications and merit. Mr. Harrison, given what happened tonight, I think we both know that's impossible, Sarah replied. There's no way this situation won't influence how things proceed from here. Harrison was quiet for a moment, clearly grappling with the ethical implications of the situation they now found themselves in. Finally, he spoke with what sounded like genuine conviction. You're right that this complicates things, he admitted. But Ms. Martinez, after tonight, after seeing how you handled yourself under pressure and learning about your background and qualifications, I can honestly say that Apex would be lucky to have someone like you on their team. Sarah studied his face, trying to determine whether this was another manipulation or a genuine expression of respect. The problem was that even if Harrison was being sincere now, the power dynamic between them made any professional relationship potentially problematic. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate what you're saying, but I hope you can understand why I might be skeptical about any professional opportunity that involves you, given how this evening began. I completely understand, Harrison said, and I have a suggestion if you're willing to consider it. Sarah waited, curious despite herself about what he might propose. Tomorrow, go to your interview exactly as planned. Don't mention our encounter tonight unless you choose to. Let the Apex team evaluate you based on your qualifications and performance. I'll make sure that no one involved in the hearing process knows about our interaction. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. If they offer you the position based on merit, then you'll know it was earned fairly. If they don't, you'll know it was a legitimate business decision. Either way, tonight's events won't factor into their assessment. Sarah found herself intrigued by this proposal, though she remained cautious. And what about after the interview? If I do get hired, how do we handle the fact that you're ultimately my boss? Harrison thought about this for a moment. Honestly, I rarely interact directly with Apex personnel. The company has its own management structure, and I try not to interfere with their operations. It's possible we might never work together directly. As they reached the main terminal, Sarah realized she needed to make a decision. She could walk away from the interview entirely, avoiding any potential complications, but also giving up an opportunity she had worked hard to secure. Or she could trust that Harrison's apparent transformation was genuine and proceed with the original plan. Mr. Harrison, she said finally, I'm going to hold you to your promise about keeping tonight's events separate from my interview. But I want to be clear about something. If I sense any retaliation, manipulation, or special treatment because of what happened between us, I'll walk away immediately and make sure everyone knows exactly why. That's completely fair, Harrison agreed. And Ms. Martinez, for what it's worth, I hope you get the job, not because of tonight, but because someone with your background and character is exactly the kind of person Apex needs. As they parted ways in the terminal, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how dramatically the evening had evolved. What had started as a simple flight from San to New York had become a complex encounter that challenged both her assumptions and Harrison's, ultimately revealing truths about prejudice, respect, and the unexpected ways that people's lives could become interconnected. Walking toward the taxi stand, Sarah found herself genuinely uncertain about what the next day would bring. But for the first time in hours, she felt cautiously optimistic that her new chapter in civilian life might just be beginning in the most unexpected way possible. Sarah spent a restless night in her hotel room, replaying the events of the flight and trying to prepare mentally for the interview. Every time she began to focus on the job requirements and her qualifications, her mind drifted back to Harrison's behavior and his revelation about owning the company. Despite his promises about keeping the two situations separate, she couldn't shake the feeling that the interview process had been fundamentally compromised. She arrived at the Apex Security Solutions office in Manhattan 30 minutes early, using the extra time to observe the building and the people entering and leaving. It was a professional habit from her military days, always assess the environment before entering unknown territory. The office was located on the 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown, and everything about the company's presentation suggested competence and success. The reception area was tastefully decorated with awards and commendations, photos of Apex personnel protecting various dignitaries, and subtle displays of high-tech security equipment. Sarah noted several employees moving through the space with the kind of alertness and bearing she recognized from her military experience. These were serious professionals, not corporate security guards playing dress-up. Ms. Martinez, a woman in her 40s, approached with a confident stride and firm handshake. I'm Director Jennifer. Thank you for coming in today. Jennifer was exactly what Sarah had expected from the company's reputation. She moved with military precision, her clothing was professional but practical, and her eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of high-stakes decision-making. Sarah felt immediately more confident about the legitimacy of the interview process. Thank you for the opportunity, Sarah replied. I'm looking forward to learning more about Apex and discussing how my background might contribute to your team. As they walked toward the conference room, Jennifer provided background information about the company. Apex was founded 8 years ago by former Secret Service and military personnel. We specialize in executive protection, threat assessment, and corporate security consulting. Our clients include Fortune 500 CEOs, government officials, and high-profile individuals who require discreet but comprehensive protection. The conference room overlooked the city, and Sarah found herself momentarily distracted by the view before focusing back on Jennifer and the two other people who had joined them. Mike, a former Marine who served as head of operations, and Dr. Lisa Park, a civilian expert in threat psychology who handled the company's consulting work. "Before we begin," Jennifer said, "I want to acknowledge that your background is quite unique. We've worked with many former special operations personnel, but you're the first female SEAL candidate we've interviewed. We're very interested in hearing about your experience and how it might apply to our work." Sarah felt a familiar tension. Even here, in what should have been a straightforward job interview, her gender was being treated as the primary notable aspect of her qualifications. But she recognized that Jennifer's comment came from genuine professional interest rather than the prejudicial assumptions she had encountered from Harrison. "I appreciate your directness," Sarah replied. "I'd prefer to focus on my operational experience and tactical skills rather than making my gender the central topic, but I understand that my background raises questions you might not have considered before." Mike leaned forward with obvious interest. "Can you walk us through your training and operational history? Obviously, we understand that much of it is classified, but we'd like to understand the scope of your experience." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes providing a carefully edited overview of her military career. She described the SEAL training pipeline, the physical and mental demands of the program, and the types of missions she had been involved in without revealing any classified details. Her interviewers asked thoughtful, professional questions that demonstrated their own understanding of military operations. "What made you decide to transition to civilian life?" Dr. Park asked. 8 years is a significant commitment, but many special operations personnel serve much longer." "I accomplished what I set out to do in the military," Sarah replied honestly. "I proved that I could succeed in that environment, completed my mission successfully, and served my country with honor. Now I want to apply those skills in a different context while having more control over my personal life and career trajectory." Jennifer nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thoughtful transition planning we like to see. Too many former military personnel struggle in civilian roles because they haven't adequately considered how their skills translate or what they want from their post-service careers." The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from tactical scenarios to client relations to team dynamics. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed with the company's professionalism and the caliber of questions she was being asked. These people understood the work they were doing and were clearly committed to maintaining high standards. "Ms. Martinez," Mike said near the end of the formal interview, "I have to ask, what do you know about our corporate structure? Have you researched Blake Industries and their relationship to Apex?" Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment she had been dreading, when Harrison's connection to the company would inevitably surface. She had decided during her sleepless night that honesty was the only viable approach. "I know that Apex is a subsidiary of Blake Industries," she replied carefully. "I also know that Harrison Blake is the CEO of the parent company." "Have you had any previous contact with Mr. Blake or anyone else at Blake Industries?" Jennifer asked, her tone remaining professional but with a slight edge that suggested this was an important question. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would likely determine the outcome of the interview. "Yes, I actually met Mr. Blake last night on the flight from San. We had an interaction that I think you should know about." The three interviewers exchanged glances, and Sarah could see their professional demeanor shifting slightly as they prepared to hear something that might complicate their decision-making process. "What kind of interaction?" Dr. Park asked. Sarah spent the next 10 minutes describing the events on the plane, from Harrison's initial attempts to claim her seat through their final conversation in the terminal. She tried to present the facts objectively, neither demonizing Harrison nor minimizing the impact of his behavior. When she finished, the room was quiet for several moments. Jennifer was the first to speak. "Ms. Martinez, that's quite a story. How do you feel about potentially working for a company owned by someone who treated you that way?" "To be honest, I'm conflicted," Sarah admitted. "Mr. Blake did apologize and seemed to genuinely regret his behavior by the end of the flight. He also promised that our encounter wouldn't influence this interview process, but I'd be lying if I said it doesn't complicate my feelings about the opportunity." Mike was shaking his head with obvious disgust. I've worked with Harrison Blake for 3 years, and while he can be demanding and occasionally difficult, what you're describing goes way beyond his usual personality. That behavior is completely unacceptable, regardless of what might have prompted it. Dr. Park was taking notes rapidly. This presents some ethical concerns that we'll need to consider carefully. On one hand, your qualifications and interview performance have been excellent. On the other hand, the power dynamics created by last night's incident could create ongoing problems. Jennifer looked directly at Sarah. If we were to offer you a position with Apex, how would you handle future interactions with Mr. Blake? Sarah had thought about this question extensively during her sleepless night. I would treat him professionally and with respect, as I would any client or corporate executive. What happened last night was inappropriate, but people can learn and change. If Mr. Blake has genuinely reflected on his behavior and commits to treating me as he would any other professional, then I'm willing to move forward. And if he doesn't, Mike asked, then I'll deal with that situation appropriately when and if it arises, Sarah replied firmly. I didn't complete SEAL training and serve 8 years in special operations by avoiding difficult situations or backing down from challenges. Jennifer smiled at this response. That's exactly what we'd expect to hear from someone with your background. After the formal interview concluded, Sarah was asked to wait in the reception area while the team discussed her candidacy. She spent the time reviewing the company literature and observing the employees who moved through the space. Everything she saw reinforced her positive impression of Apex as a serious, professional organization. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer returned and invited Sarah back into the conference room. The atmosphere felt different, now less formal, more collegial. Ms. Martinez, Jennifer began, we'd like to offer you a position as a senior protection specialist with Apex Security Solutions. Sarah felt a wave of relief and excitement, though she tried to keep her expression professional. Thank you. I'm very interested. Can you tell me more about the specific role and expectations? Mike took over the briefing. You'd be working primarily with our executive protection teams, handling threat assessments, advanced planning for client movements, and direct protection duties. The starting salary is $95,000 annually, with full benefits and opportunities for advancement based on performance. There's one additional element to discuss, Jennifer added. Given the situation with Mr. Blake, we want to establish some clear protocols. First, all of your assignments and performance evaluations will be handled entirely within Apex's management structure. Blake Industries executives, including Mr. Blake himself, will have no input into your day-to-day work or career progression. Dr. Park continued the explanation. Second, if you ever have professional interactions with Mr. Blake, either Mike or I will be present to ensure appropriate boundaries are maintained. We're not going to put you in a position where last night's incident could create ongoing problems. Finally, Jennifer concluded, we want you to know that we've documented this entire situation in our files. If Mr. Blake ever attempts to retaliate against you or treat you inappropriately in the future, we have a clear record of both his previous behavior and our commitment to protecting our employees from that kind of treatment. Sarah was genuinely moved by these protections. I appreciate how thoroughly you've thought through the potential complications. That level of support means a lot to me. It's not just support, Mike said firmly. It's good business. We can't have our employees worried about personal vendettas or power games interfering with their ability to do their jobs. Our clients trust us to maintain the highest professional standards, and that includes how we treat our own people. As Sarah left the Apex offices with a job offer and a start date 2 weeks away, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. The confrontation with Harrison that could have ruined her career opportunity had instead revealed the integrity of the company she hoped to join and provided her with valuable insight into how they handled challenging situations. Her phone buzzed with a text message as she walked toward the subway station. The number wasn't familiar, but the message was from Harrison Blake. Ms. Martinez, I heard that your interview went well and that Apex made you an offer. Congratulations. I want you to know that I kept my promise about not interfering with their decision-making process. I hope you accept the position and have a successful career with the company. Harrison Blake. Sarah stared at the message for several moments, trying to determine how she felt about this contact. On one hand, it was appropriate for him to confirm that he had honored his commitment. On the other hand, the fact that he already knew about her job offer suggested that he was more involved in Apex's operations than Jennifer had implied. She decided not to respond to the text message immediately. Instead, she would mention it to Jennifer when she called to formally accept the position. If Harrison was going to continue inserting himself into her professional life, it was better to address that issue transparently from the beginning. As she descended into the subway station, Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic about her future. The job at Apex represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had hoped to find: meaningful work that utilized her skills, professional colleagues who understood her background, and the chance to build a civilian career that honored her military experience without being defined entirely by it. The encounter with Harrison had been deeply unpleasant, but it had also revealed something important about her own character and resilience. She had faced down hostile foreign combatants in classified operations around the world, but handling a drunk, entitled businessman on a domestic flight had required different skills, patience, dignity, and the ability to maintain her principles under social rather than physical pressure. Tomorrow she would fly back to San to finalize her transition out of the military and prepare for her move to New York. In 2 weeks, she would begin her new career with Apex Security Solutions. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she felt ready to face them with the same determination and professionalism that had carried her through 8 years of military service. The train arrived, and as Sarah settled into her seat for the ride back to her hotel, she allowed herself a small smile. Her new chapter in civilian life was beginning, and despite the rocky start, she had every reason to believe it was going to be exactly what she had hoped for. The reflection in the subway window showed a woman who had faced an unexpected challenge and emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of her own worth. Whatever Harrison Blake's true motivations might be, and whatever complications might arise in the future, Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever came next. 3 months into her new position at Apex Security Solutions, Sarah had established herself as one of the company's most reliable and effective protection specialists. Her military training translated seamlessly to executive protection work, and her ability to assess threats and maintain calm under pressure had earned her respect from both colleagues and clients. She had successfully completed assignments protecting a tech CEO during a contentious shareholder meeting, a federal judge receiving death threats, and a Fortune 500 executive traveling through several high-risk international locations. Each assignment had reinforced her confidence that transitioning to civilian security work had been the right decision. Jennifer had been true to her word about keeping Blake Industries executives out of Apex's operational decisions. Sarah hadn't seen or heard from Harrison Blake since starting her new job, despite the fact that his company's headquarters was only 15 floors above the Apex offices in the same building. That changed on a Tuesday morning in November, when Jennifer called Sarah into her office with an unusual expression on her face. "Sarah, we have a situation that's going to require careful handling," Jennifer began. "Blake Industries has requested executive protection for Harrison Blake himself. Apparently, he's been receiving threatening communications related to some business decisions, and his regular security team is unavailable due to a family emergency." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "I see, and you want me to handle the assignment." "Actually, Mr. Blake specifically requested that you not be involved," Jennifer replied. "He said he thought it might be uncomfortable for both of you given your previous interaction." This revelation surprised Sarah. She had expected that if Harrison ever needed Apex services, he might try to manipulate the situation to force another encounter with her, either to prove he had changed or to assert his authority over her career. The fact that he was actively trying to avoid working with her suggested a different motivation. "What's your assessment of the request?" Sarah asked. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Professionally, you're the most qualified specialist we have available for this type of assignment. Mike is handling the federal judge case, Lisa is coordinating the international travel security, and our other senior people are committed to existing clients." She paused, studying Sarah's expression. "But I'm also concerned about the ethics of forcing you to work directly with someone who treated you so poorly, regardless of whether he's apologized or claims to have changed." Sarah appreciated Jennifer's consideration for her feelings, but she also recognized the professional implications of the situation. If she couldn't work with Harrison Blake, then essentially she was being excluded from any assignments involving the company's primary client. That could limit her career advancement and create awkward dynamics within the team. "What's the nature of the threats he's been receiving?" Sarah asked. According to the initial briefing, Blake Industries recently closed a manufacturing plant in Ohio, resulting in significant job losses. Some of the displaced workers have been increasingly aggressive in their communications, and yesterday someone left a package outside Blake's apartment building that contained what appeared to be a mock explosive device. Sarah's professional instincts kicked in immediately. That's definitely escalating beyond normal labor dispute rhetoric. A fake bomb suggests someone with technical knowledge and the willingness to commit serious criminal acts. This could develop into a legitimate threat very quickly. Jennifer nodded. "Exactly my assessment. This isn't just angry emails or phone calls anymore. Someone is willing to invest time and effort in threatening Blake directly, and they're sophisticated enough to create realistic-looking devices." "Has law enforcement been?" "Yes, the NYPD and FBI are both investigating. But Blake still needs close protection while they work the case, especially since he has several public appearances scheduled this week that can't be easily canceled." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, thinking through the implications. On a personal level, working closely with Harrison Blake would be challenging and potentially uncomfortable. On a professional level, refusing the assignment would compromise her effectiveness as a protection specialist and could damage her standing within Apex. But there was another consideration that ultimately proved decisive: the nature of the threat itself. Sarah had seen what happened when security professionals let personal feelings interfere with their judgment, and people died as a result. If Harrison Blake was facing a genuine threat, then her feelings about their previous encounter were irrelevant. "Jennifer, I want to take the assignment," Sarah said firmly. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured into working with him." "I'm sure. First, professionally speaking, I'm the best person available to handle this type of threat. Second, I took an oath to protect people regardless of my personal feelings about them. That oath didn't end when I left the military." Jennifer smiled approvingly. "That's exactly the response I hoped to hear, but I wanted the decision to be entirely yours." "What's the timeline?" "Blake has a board meeting this afternoon, a charity gala tonight, and a series of investor meetings tomorrow. The threats specifically mentioned this week's activities, so we need to assume the threatener has detailed knowledge of his schedule." Sarah felt the familiar focus that came with mission planning. Personal complications faded into the background as she shifted into operational mode. "I'll need his complete itinerary, details about the venues, information about his usual transportation and security protocols, and full briefings on the threat communications." "Everything will be ready within the hour. There's one more thing." Blake asked if he could speak with you privately before the assignment begins. He said he wanted to address the elephant in the room and establish clear professional boundaries. Sarah considered this request. Part of her wanted to avoid any unnecessary personal interaction with Harrison, but she also recognized that effective protection required clear communication between the protector and the client. "Set up a brief meeting for 30 minutes before I take over his security. Keep it professional and time-limited." An hour later, Sarah was reviewing threat assessments and venue security plans when Jennifer escorted Harrison Blake into the conference room. Sarah looked up from her files and was struck by how different he appeared from the aggressive, entitled man she had encountered on the airplane. Harrison was dressed in an expensive but conservative business suit, and his demeanor was serious and professional rather than confrontational. More significantly, he looked genuinely concerned rather than merely inconvenienced by the security situation. "Ms. Martinez," he said as he took a seat across from her, "thank you for agreeing to handle my protection despite our previous encounter. I want you to know that I specifically asked Apex to assign someone else because I didn't want you to feel obligated to work with me. Mr. Blake, I appreciate your consideration, but I'm here because I'm the most qualified person available for this assignment," Sarah replied professionally. "Our previous interaction won't affect my ability to provide effective protection." Harrison nodded, seeming relieved by her direct approach. "I want to establish some ground rules if that's acceptable. First, I'll follow your security directives completely and without argument. Second, I won't make any reference to our flight encounter unless you bring it up. Third, I'll treat you exactly as I would any other professional security specialist. Those terms are acceptable, Sarah said. I have some requirements as well. You'll need to provide complete honesty about your activities, relationships, and any information that might be relevant to the threat assessment. You'll follow my instructions immediately and without debate, even if they seem unnecessary or inconvenient. And you'll trust my judgment about security matters even when it conflicts with your business preferences. Agreed, Harrison said immediately. Sarah opened her briefing file. Let's start with the threat assessment. Tell me about the factory closure and the specific individuals who have been making threatening communications. For the next 20 minutes, Harrison provided detailed information about the business decision that had triggered the threats. Blake Industries had closed a manufacturing facility in Youngstown, Ohio, eliminating 800 jobs. While the company had provided severance packages and job placement assistance, the closure had devastated the local community. The threatening messages started about 6 weeks ago, Harrison explained. Initially, they were just angry emails and phone calls from displaced workers, but over the past 2 weeks, they've become more specific and more personal. He handed Sarah a folder containing copies of the most concerning communications. Yesterday's incident with the fake bomb was the first time someone took physical action, but the messages suggest they're building toward something more serious. Sarah reviewed the threat communications with the analytical approach she had used for enemy intelligence during her military service. The progression showed clear escalation, and the language suggested someone with military or technical training. This individual has specific knowledge about explosives and tactical operations, she observed. The fake device was sophisticated enough to require specialized knowledge to construct. Have you considered that this might be a veteran who lost his job when the factory closed? Harrison looked surprised by this assessment. I hadn't thought about that angle, but it makes sense. The factory did employ several former military personnel in technical positions. We'll need to coordinate with law enforcement to cross-reference the employee records with military service history, Sarah said, making notes in her file. This could help narrow down the suspect list significantly. As they discussed the security arrangements for Harrison's upcoming activities, Sarah found herself grudgingly impressed by his cooperation and professionalism. The entitled, aggressive behavior she had witnessed on the airplane was nowhere in evidence. Instead, Harrison asked intelligent questions about security procedures and accepted her recommendations without argument. Mr. Blake, there's one more issue we need to address, Sarah said as they prepared to conclude the briefing. Your public appearances this week make you particularly vulnerable. The charity gala tonight will have over 500 attendees, limited security screening, and multiple access points. I'm recommending that you cancel your attendance. Harrison was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his security against his business obligations. The gala is raising money for veterans organizations. I'm the keynote speaker, and my attendance will significantly impact their fundraising success. Is there any way to attend safely? Sarah appreciated that he was considering the impact on the veterans' charity rather than just his own convenience. We can make it work, but it will require extensive advanced security measures and significant restrictions on your movement within the venue. Whatever you think is necessary, Harrison agreed immediately. The charity gala was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Sarah spent the afternoon coordinating with venue security, reviewing floor plans, and establishing secure routes and emergency procedures. She also arranged for backup personnel from Apex to cover additional positions, ensuring comprehensive protection despite the challenging environment. As evening approached, Sarah met Harrison at his apartment to escort him to the gala. She had changed into formal attire appropriate for the event, a black evening dress that was elegant but allowed for freedom of movement, with concealed provisions for her protective equipment. Ms. Martinez, you look very professional, Harrison said as they prepared to leave. I realize this assignment must be particularly challenging given our history, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your professionalism. Thank you, Mr. Blake. Let's focus on getting through this evening safely. The drive to the museum was uneventful, but Sarah remained alert to their surroundings and potential threats. Her earpiece crackled with regular updates from the security team positioned around the venue, and everything appeared normal as they arrived at the museum's main entrance. Inside the gala, Sarah maintained a discreet but constant presence near Harrison as he moved through the crowd, greeting donors and speaking with other attendees. She noted several individuals who warranted closer observation, people who seemed more interested in Harrison than in the charitable cause, guests who didn't fit the typical demographic for the event, and anyone displaying unusual behavior. About halfway through the evening, as Harrison was delivering his keynote speech about supporting veterans' transition to civilian careers, Sarah noticed a disturbance near the museum's main entrance. Through her earpiece, she heard one of her backup team members reporting suspicious activity. "Base, this is at the main entrance. We have an individual attempting to gain access without proper credentials. Subject claims to be a veteran who deserves to attend the event. He's becoming increasingly agitated when entry." Sarah felt her training and instincts activate immediately. The timing and location of this disturbance, combined with the threat pattern they had identified, suggested this could be more than a random incident. "Can you provide a description of the individual?" she whispered into her microphone. "Male, approximately 45 years old, wearing what appears to be military surplus clothing. He's making specific references to Blake Industries and claiming he has a right to face the man who destroyed his life." Sarah's pulse quickened. This matched the profile they had developed for their primary threat, and the fact that the individual was specifically targeting Harrison suggested this was not a coincidence. "Maintain visual contact, but do not engage directly. I'm requesting immediate law enforcement backup to your location." While continuing to monitor Harrison's speech and the crowd around him, Sarah coordinated with museum security and the NYPD to address the situation at the entrance. Her training had taught her to plan for multiple contingencies simultaneously, and she began considering evacuation routes and protective procedures if the situation escalated. Harrison concluded his speech to enthusiastic applause, seemingly unaware of the developing threat. As he stepped away from the podium and rejoined the crowd, Sarah moved closer to his position. "Mr. Blake," she said quietly, "we need to discuss a slight change in our departure plans. There's been a security concern that requires us to use an alternate route." Harrison looked at her with immediate understanding and concern. "How serious is the situation?" "Potentially serious, but manageable if we follow protocols," Sarah replied professionally. "I need you to continue your normal interactions for about 10 more minutes while my team resolves the issue, then we'll leave through the museum's staff entrance." "Understood," Harrison said, and Sarah was impressed by his calm response to the news. Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah received regular updates about the situation at the main entrance. Law enforcement had arrived and was interviewing the individual who had been entry. His identity confirmed Sarah's suspicions. He was Robert, a former Army explosive ordnance disposal specialist who had lost his job when the Youngstown factory closed. "Base, this is Detective Williams, NYPD," came through Sarah's earpiece. "Subject is Robert, 44 years old, former military EOD specialist, unemployed since the Blake Industries factory closure. We're taking him into custody for questioning, but he had no weapons or explosive devices in his possession." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued concern. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, the fact that it specifically targeted the charity gala suggested he had detailed knowledge of Harrison's schedule and activities. "Copy, Detective Williams. Please maintain security around the venue until we've completed our departure. Subject may have accomplices or additional plans we're not aware of." Sarah guided Harrison through his final interactions at the gala, then escorted him safely out of the museum through the staff entrance where their secure transportation was waiting. During the drive back to his apartment, she briefed him on the evening's events. "The individual who attempted to gain entry was Robert, the former EOD specialist I identified as a potential threat during our earlier briefing," she explained. "He was taken into custody for questioning, but we need to assume there may be additional threats or accomplices." Harrison was quiet for several moments, processing this information. "Ms. Martinez, your threat assessment and security planning probably prevented a very dangerous situation tonight. I'm genuinely grateful for your professionalism and effectiveness." "Just doing my job, Mr. Blake," Sarah replied, though she was pleased that her analysis had proven accurate and potentially prevented a serious incident. As they arrived at Harrison's building, Sarah conducted a final security sweep before escorting him to his apartment. At his door, Harrison turned to face her directly. "Ms. Martinez, I know this assignment has been complicated by our previous encounter, but I want you to know that working with you has been a privilege. You're clearly exceptional at what you do, and I'm sorry that my behavior on that flight almost cost me the opportunity to see you demonstrate your professional capabilities." Sarah studied his expression, seeing what appeared to be genuine respect and gratitude. "Mr. Blake, thank you for your cooperation throughout this assignment. Your willingness to follow security protocols made my job much easier. Will you continue to handle my protection while the investigation is ongoing?" "That will be determined by Apex leadership based on the evolving threat assessment and available personnel," Sarah replied professionally. "But if they ask me to continue, I'm prepared to do so." As Sarah left Harrison's building and headed back to her own apartment, she reflected on how much her relationship with him had evolved since their initial encounter. While she still had reservations about his character based on their airplane interaction, she had to acknowledge that his behavior during the security assignment had been exemplary. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could maintain complete professionalism even in challenging personal circumstances. The skills and discipline she had developed during her military service had translated effectively to civilian security work, and she felt confident about her ability to handle whatever future assignments might come her way. The next morning brought news that Robert had confessed to creating the fake bomb and planning to confront Harrison at the charity gala. He had intended to publicly humiliate Harrison as revenge for the factory closure, but had not planned any physical violence. Nevertheless, his military training and unstable emotional state had made him a legitimate threat that could have escalated unpredictably. Jennifer called Sarah into her office to debrief the assignment and discuss future arrangements. "Sarah, your threat assessment and security planning last night were textbook perfect. You identified the right suspect profile, positioned resources effectively, and managed the client's safety throughout a challenging situation." "Thank you. It felt good to use my military training in a context where I could protect someone rather than neutralize threats through more aggressive means. Harrison Blake specifically requested that you continue as his primary protection specialist for the duration of this investigation," Jennifer continued. "He said your professionalism and competence were exactly what he needed during this situation." Sarah was surprised by this request, especially given Harrison's initial attempt to avoid working with her. "What's your recommendation?" "Honestly, you've proven that you can maintain appropriate boundaries and deliver excellent results even in a complicated personal situation. If you're willing to continue, I think it would benefit both you and Apex." "I'm willing," Sarah said. "This assignment has shown me that I can separate my personal feelings from my professional responsibilities, and that's an important skill for this line of work." Over the following weeks, Sarah continued providing protection for Harrison while law enforcement completed their investigation. During that time, their professional relationship evolved into something approaching mutual respect, though Sarah maintained appropriate boundaries throughout. Harrison never again referenced their airplane encounter, and his behavior remained consistently professional and respectful. He followed her security directives without question, provided honest and complete information about potential threats, and expressed genuine appreciation for her protection services. When the investigation concluded and the immediate threat was resolved, Harrison requested a final meeting with Sarah to formally conclude their professional relationship. "Ms. Martinez, this assignment has taught me several important lessons," he said. "First, that my initial assumptions about your capabilities were completely wrong and based on my own prejudices. Second, that true professionalism means focusing on the work rather than personal feelings. And third, that I have a lot to learn about treating people with the respect they deserve regardless of my preconceptions." Sarah appreciated his honesty and the evidence of genuine reflection. "Mr. Blake, I hope you apply those lessons in all your future interactions, not just with security personnel." "I intend to," Harrison replied seriously. "Ms. Martinez, if you ever need a professional reference, a business connection, or any kind of assistance with your career, please don't hesitate to contact me. You've earned my complete respect and support." As Sarah returned to her regular assignments with other Apex clients, she reflected on how the entire experience had shaped her understanding of civilian life and professional relationships. The encounter with Harrison had challenged her assumptions about people's capacity for change and growth, while also confirming her ability to maintain her principles under pressure. Her successful transition from military service to civilian security work was now complete, marked not just by professional achievement, but by personal growth and the development of skills that would serve her throughout her new career. The woman who had been thrown out of first class had become one of New York's most respected executive protection specialists, earning her place through competence, courage, and unwavering professionalism.